Okay. So give me just 1 second. Okay. Okay. So I finally got that hooked up. So let's talk about converting fractions, decimals, and percents for a minute, for those of you who are ready to move on. So if we want to convert a fraction to a decimal, how do you do that?
Divide the denominator by the numerator, or the numerator by the denominator.
Yeah, remember we said a fraction is just a division problem. So that means if you wanted to, if you're doing this by hand, the numerator is what would go here. It would be our dividend, and our denominator would be our divisor. And so what would happen is when we set this up, 8 doesn't go into 3 evenly, does it? So what do you do when that happens? I'm going to have to make sure there's a decimal point there and add a 0. And then I would divide 8 into 30, and that would go how many times? 4 is a little too much because 8 times 4 is 32. So it would go 3 times. 3 times 8 is 24. I'm going to subtract and get a 6. And then I would bring down another 0. And basically, I'm going to keep working with this if I'm doing it by hand, and I will end up with 0.375. Now, the easy way is to put it in your calculator, right? And if you do 3 divided by 8 in your calculator, check to see, does that give you 0.375? It should. So it's always the numerator divided by the denominator if you're putting it in your calculator. If you didn't have a calculator, this is how you would do it by hand. Now, what's easier is to change decimals to percents and percents to decimals. And that's more of what we're going to be doing in this course. So, for example, if we have 0.314 and we want to convert that to a percent, the rule is move the decimal 2 places to the right. And then you would put the percent sign on the end. So 0.314, if I move that decimal 2 to the right, that turns into 31.4%. Okay, 31.4%. So if I'm going from a decimal to a percent, which way do you move the decimal? To the right, and then you can put the percent sign on the end. So what do you think happens if you're going from a percent to a decimal? You move it 2 to the left and drop the percent sign. So 5.25% would turn into what is a decimal number? There you go, 0.0525. And so this is just a little table that lets you practice converting from one to the other. So if you've got your calculator, and you do 1 divided by 2, and a lot of us probably don't even need our calculator for this because you're probably pretty sure what 1/2 is as a decimal number. What is it? 0.5, which would be what number written as a percent? Good. If I move my decimal 2 to the right, remember I'm going to be filling in missing zeros. So that's why, and then I'll put the percent sign on it. So that's why it's going to be 50%. That make sense? And then they're going to give us a decimal number. Let's go from the decimal to the percent. What would 0.125 be as a percent? 0.125 turns into what as a percent? 12.5%. Okay, now, do you know how to get from a decimal back to a fraction? Well, you remember what place value is on decimals? What's the first place to the right of the decimal? Tenths. What would be the second place? Hundredths. And the third place would be what? Thousandths. So here's what you do if you want to turn it back into a fraction. Whatever you have to the right of the decimal, 1, 2, 5, you put over whatever that last place value is. Since it's in the thousandths, I'm going to put it over 1,000. And then I see if that fraction would reduce down. So I can check to see if 125 would go into 1,000 evenly. Or if I don't know and I don't have my calculator, I can divide by something that I know would go into both 125 and 1,000. What do I know would go into these numbers since one ends in 5 and one ends in 0? All right. So if I divided 5 into 125, that goes 25 times. And if I divide 5 into 1,000, that would go 200 times. Now, I think 25 over 200 reduces down too, because I think 25 will go into 200. Do you know how many times? 8 times. This is the same thing as the fraction 1 over 8. Okay? Typically, you will not have to change decimals or percents into fractions in this course, but that's how you could do it. Okay? So I'm more concerned with, can we fill in these two columns accurately? Then can you fill in the missing ones under the fraction? Y'all want to do, let's look at this one. What would you do with 127.9%? What would that look like as a decimal? Exactly. This one is actually going to have a digit that will be to the left of the decimal when you convert it back, 1.279. And that's okay. And if I were trying to change that back into a fraction, it would tell me that I would have 1,279 over 1,000. Okay, and I don't think that one's going to reduce down, but you could double check to see if because since one ends in 9 and one ends in 0, I'm pretty sure that one's not going to reduce down, but that's what it would look like. Okay, now, do you know what you do with 33 1/3% if you want to make that a decimal? Well, can you take the 1/3 and turn it into a decimal? This would be the same thing as 33 point what? Exactly, it's 3 repeating percent. So if I'm turning that back into a decimal, it just turns into what? Exactly, 0.3 repeating. And depending on the problem you're working on, if you have one of those with a repeating decimal, if it is wanting you to write something to the nearest tenth or thousandth, then you could write it as 0.33. If it's to the nearest hundredth, or 0.333. If it's to the nearest thousandth, but that would be how you would convert it. Technically, it's just repeating 3, and that bar on top would show it repeat. But if we're having to calculate something with it, we'll have to have a rounded version. Okay?